The birth of solidarity in the Lenin shipyards in Gdansk really marked the emergence of one of the most powerful and revolutionary working class movements that we've really seen for about a generation. Tragically, the self-limiting nature of that revolution ultimately was to prove the fate of that thing. And really, Colin, who's the co-author of a special issue of the International Socialism Journal, which appeared 2 years ago, called Solidarność from Gdansk to Military Repression. And just recently, a new book which has come out, published by Bookmarks, is available at the back of the room in case anybody's interested. The Festival of the Oppressed, which really looks back on the events of solidarity in Poland of 1981. Really, Colin's going to attempt to outline, in a general sense, some of the conclusions that that draws.
Comrades, when the Russian Revolution of 1917 happened, it was possible to look back at the 1905 revolution and say that was the dress rehearsal for the Russian Revolution, the Great Rehearsal. And one of the things about dress rehearsals is that what happens in the theatre when you have a dress rehearsal is you discover first of all the strengths of your performance, you also discover the weaknesses. And in many ways I think we should look on the events in Poland in 1980 to 1981 as a great rehearsal for the Socialist Revolution, with amazing strengths but also fantastic weaknesses. Now, what happened in Poland I think we can see as an amazing confirmation of some of the central aspects of our political ideas in our tendency. Firstly, Poland, a state capitalist country, fiercely class-divided society with immense crises, economic crises. In fact, Poland, 1979 to 1981, experienced the worst collapse of production of any capitalist power in the world since the war, any advanced capitalist power in the world since the war. Processes of immensely sharp class struggle developed in state capitalist Poland, entirely in accordance with our theory. I mean, it's not to, I don't think the comrades in Poland did that to prove our theory correct. It shows, however, the strength of our theory. Secondly, I think what we have to say about the solidarity movement is that what it revealed is something which we continually emphasize, the immense potential of a modern, advanced working class to engage in the process of its own self-emancipation. And more than that, to draw behind it, its own movement, all the other oppressed and exploited layers of society in an immense movement for social change, for social reconstruction. On the other hand, we also have to say that what happened in Poland in 1980 to 1981 is a terribly tragic story, the story of a great workers' movement without a revolutionary leadership. Now, where did solidarity come from? The starting point of solidarity was really the question of pork chops. The question of the price of food has been, for many years, between the working class and their rulers in Poland, a central issue of conflict. In 1970, because of the stagnation of the Polish economy, back in 1970, the stagnant Polish economy, in Christmas week 1970, the regime announced a huge food price rise. And the workers of Szczecin and of Gdansk and Gdynia, the coastal cities of Poland, immediately went on strike. They rioted in the streets and so on. And the regime responded with fiercely repressive measures. They mowed down large numbers of workers outside the Gdynia railway station with machine gun fire. There were then further protest occupations. The Polish workers of Szczecin rediscovered the occupation strike. And finally, when the women of the Łódź, or Lodz in spelling, but Łódź in terms of pronunciation, textile factories went on strike, the government was forced to take back all the price increases. And actually the government of Gomulka was overthrown from the top and a new regime was established. The workers of Poland, for the second time in their history since the war, had by their movements changed the government. They don't have elections in Poland, they have workers' movements to change the government, which is really a much preferable method, as a matter of fact. Again in 1976, after the boom of the early 70s, when the Polish economy was open to the West, in 1976, with the re-onset of the beginnings of crisis, the government tried to raise food prices again. And immediately the workers of the city of Radom went on strike and they marched in the streets. The workers of the Ursus tractor factory outside Warsaw marched out of their factory to the railway lines and ripped up the railway lines that connect Port Paris with Moscow. The main intercontinental line, as it were, was ripped up so that whatever happened to them, people would remember their struggle. Within 24 hours, the government withdrew the price increases. It backed down within 24 hours with the broadcast. Price increases are off. Now, the Polish economy thereafter went into deeper and deeper crisis. The debts mounted up. By 1980, in fact, the debts amounted to something over $20 billion to Western banks. And on July the 1st, 1980, the government decided to try once again to make the working class pay for the prices by announcing a price increase. They didn't do it in a straightforward way this time by saying there's going to be an increase in the price of pork chops and other meat supplies. What they did was instead to say, we're moving some of the meat supplies from the price-controlled shops to the free price shops. The better cuts of meat are only going to be available now at market prices rather than at controlled prices. And immediately there was a wave of strikes in Poland, beginning on July the 1st. Now there was a background to this, which was that between 1976 and 1980, in fact there had been something like 4,000 strikes in Poland. It was said, there are in fact in Poland 49 official provinces of Poland. But it was said, in fact, by economists that there was really a 50th province in Poland, which consisted of lorries filled with refrigerated meat, which were rushed to different parts of the country when workers went on strike over wages or working conditions and so on, to buy off workers' discontent. The government was very nervous by 1980 of the working class. That was why they had this only hidden form of price rise, but immediately the reaction of workers was to go on strike. And the immediate response of the government to the strikes was to make concessions. Not to send in the troops, but actually to offer pay increases. And there was factory after factory went on strike, pay increases were awarded. In fact, it was noticed in some places, the government, if you want to know about the stupidity of the ruling class sometimes, you really have to see what they did in Poland, because they only paid pay increases to workers who went on strike. So there were actually factories where some of the workers went on strike, and they were the only ones who got pay increases. You can see how that would encourage a strike movement in Poland. So all through July 1980, and through the early weeks of August 1980, there was strike after strike after strike. And as this strike movement gathered pace in Poland, so the demands of the workers started to rise. In Lublin, in mid-July 1980, Lublin is a city very near the Russian border. There was in fact a general strike for several days, and they blocked the railway lines with railway engines to stop the traffic with Russia, and so on and so on. And the strike committee in Lublin in fact started to enunciate more political demands, and not simply demands about wages and working conditions. Now finally, the strike, I should say one other thing about this whole strike movement, and that is that there was a body, a very important organisation, which played a very, very significant role in generalising these strikes and spreading them. It was a little group of people called the Committee for the Defence of Workers, which had been established in 1976 after the repression that followed the strikes in Radom. The Committee for the Defence of Workers. And that little group of people, they started off as a little group of dissident intellectuals, one of the leading members of whom was a man called Kuron, who in the 1960s had been a revolutionary Marxist, though by then his politics had moved to a left reformist position. They, in fact, had, first of all, raised funds for legal defences of workers who'd been coming up in the courts. But then they went on to start issuing a paper called The Worker. And by 1980, in fact, it had a circulation of something like 20,000 copies. And through their activities, they in fact started, in the latter part of the 70s, they began to draw around them small groups of workers in a number of industrial centres. So that, for example, in Gdansk, there was a group of workers, perhaps a dozen, 15, 20 workers, who were already organised around CORE and the local paper called the Coastal Worker. And they, in fact, had worked together with CORE to develop a series of demands called the Workers' Charter. And they, in fact, had tried to organise in one or two factories. They'd already been able to discuss together about tactics and so on. So there was this little kernel of organised workers around CORE who were to play an absolutely fundamental role in the struggles that were to come. Now, what happened in Gdansk, where the movement rose to a whole new level, was that I've forgotten the day, anyway, on the Wednesday, just about the middle of August, a 50-year-old crane driver, a woman, a grandmother, called Anna Valentinovich, was sacked from the shipyard. She was a member of this coastal worker group. She was highly respected in the shipyard as a militant, and she was sacked for her militancy. And that night, this little group, the coastal worker group, met, and they decided that now the time had come for the strike movement to come to Gdansk. And that night they hand-wrote some leaflets and posters and went into work the next morning into the Gdansk shipyard and into one or two of the other workplaces in Gdansk, carrying with them under their coats the leaflets. And they simply, when they went into work, they went into their different sections in the shipyard, huge shipyard employing 15, 20,000 workers. And in their sections they put up the posters and they started a discussion. And within 2 hours, the whole of the Gdansk shipyard, they marched workers around the shipyard, within 2 hours, the whole of the Gdansk shipyard had come to a standstill and was under occupation. And the government, the local government officials, the district party secretary, the shipyard manager immediately entered into negotiations with them. Other workers in Gdansk had come out on strike in support of them, including, crucially, the tram drivers of Gdansk. And after 2 days, on the Saturday, in fact, all their demands had been met, just as had happened in other factories up and down Poland. They got the biggest pay increase they'd ever had in their lives. They got the reinstatement of Anna Valentinovich. In fact, the manager sent his car to her flat to bring her to the factory to show that she was really reinstated. A man called Lech Wałęsa, who'd been sacked from the factory a year before, in fact had climbed over the wall, because he knew the occupation was going to take place. He climbed over the wall and joined the strike, and in fact emerged immediately as the chairman of the strike committee. He also was a member of the coastal worker, this little coastal worker group. And, as I say, they won their demands. The third demand they put forward, which was agreed to, was that they could build a monument outside the shipyard gate to the workers who'd been killed in 1970 by the security forces. Amazing demand, which was actually granted to them. They could build them a 100-foot high monument outside the shipyard gate to the workers dead. And there the thing might have ended. You've won all your demands. In fact, Lech Wałęsa went onto the tannoy in the shipyard and announced that the strike was over. And if that had been all there was to the story, it would have been quite an interesting work of victory, an interesting strike, and so on. And there would have been no solidarity, except for one thing, a woman worker from the tram drivers who said, "You bastards, you're going back to work and we haven't won anything." By this time, there were workers streaming out of the gates of the shipyards who'd won their victory. And Lech Wałęsa, about whom all sorts of less pleasant things can be said later on, at that moment rose to his highest point as a workers' leader. Because he didn't argue, he just said, "You're absolutely right, the strike is on again." Turned to the tannoy to discover that it had been switched off by the management, very quickly, unplugged, disconnected. And so Anna Valentinovich and Alina Pinkowska, the nurse from the shipyard clinic, and other workers rushed to the factory gates and stood at the factory gates and argued and argued and argued with the workers. They managed to stop 2,000 workers from leaving. And the shipyard was reoccupied that night on the Saturday by only a minority of the workers. But the delegates from the other workplaces that were still on strike reassembled that night in the Gdansk shipyard, and they set up a new organisation to reorganise the strike. And they called themselves the MKS, and that means, in English, the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. The Inter-Factory Strike Committee. And the Inter-Factory Strike Committee was the body that then negotiated, finally, in the shipyards. They forced the government to come to the shipyards to negotiate with them on behalf of the working class of Gdansk and indeed of the whole of Poland. Now, a number of things need to be said about the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. Firstly, just what was its form? It was made up of delegates. It consisted of a delegate from each workplace that went on strike. And by the end of August, when the final negotiations came to success, the Inter-Factory Strike Committee had 700 delegates. 700 enterprises in the Gdansk region had come out on strike and sent their delegates to the Inter-Factory Strike Committee. The demands that the Inter-Factory Strike Committee raised were no longer demands simply about monuments and improvements in conditions and wages and reinstatement of militants. Now that they've reorganised themselves, that first Saturday night they drew up a new set of demands, which they called the 21 demands. And the first demand was a demand for free trade unions. And the second demand was a demand for the abolition of censorship. And the third demand was the demand for the freeing of all political prisoners. And then there were demands about the improvements in the health service. The demands became political demands. So you had an Inter-Factory Strike Committee raising political demands and negotiating these and winning them all, as a matter of fact, with the regime. Not only that, the Interfactory Strike Committee took over control of aspects of the processes of production and distribution in the Gdansk area. The trams continued to run with posters on them saying, "We are on strike, but we are acting in support of the working class. This workers need to move around in Gdansk." So the trams continued to run, now under workers' control. Food, the bakeries remained open, under workers' control. The fish canning factory remained open, under workers' control. They banned the distribution of alcohol, even not only of vodka, but also of beer. And the production and distribution was all stopped in the Gdansk area. You might find that, comrades might find that a little uncomfortable as an idea. In fact, there's a real problem in Poland about drunkenness in the working class. The major problem of alcoholism is absolutely necessary so as not to enable any problem about alcohol opening ways for agent provocateur and so on within the strike. They banned the control, the use of alcohol, and so on and so on. In fact, as one of their members said, since we're now running this town, we better organise ourselves. There was that sort of sense that they had taken over these things. And they entered into negotiations with the government. They forced the government to come to the shipyard and negotiate with them there on their demands. And the negotiations were conducted in a big hall in the Lenin shipyard with the statue of Lenin looking over with a religious cross beside him, it has to be said, put there by the religious workers. And in this shipyard, the negotiations were conducted in front of the 700 delegates. And the microphones were joined up, were linked up, and in fact they would play all over the shipyard. So that all the workers who come into the shipyard, those who couldn't get into the hall and so on, could all listen to the negotiations and of course cheer and boo and so on through the windows and so on. So the whole thing was immensely democratic form of negotiation with the government. And this Interfactory Strike Committee was a form that spread outside Gdansk. Within a few days, the workers of Szczecin, up the coast, about 80 miles up the coast, went to work to discover that they got a pay increase without having asked for one. So they decided they better have a meeting about this and decided to form an Interfactory Strike Committee. The same happened in a major industrial city in the south called Wrocław. It used to be called Breslau when it was in Germany. An Interfactory Strike Committee, 50, 60 enterprises going on strike, joining this. The government hoped right up to the last minute that they'd still be able to hang on to their old stronghold in the mining areas right in the south of Poland, and then finally, right at the end of August, another Interfactory Strike Committee was set up in the town called Jastrzębie, if I have not mispronounced it, where miners and all sorts of other workers in the area formed another Interfactory Strike Committee. The government knew the game was up, and they negotiated agreements with the workers in the different Interfactory Strike Committees. And the 21 points were won. And before the workers agreed to sign allow Lech Wałęsa with his great big pen that he got from the Pope to sign, or the author's, papal memoir, to sign the agreement in front of the assembled delegates and the world television cameras and so on. They said, we're not going to sign until you release all the dissidents who've been arrested during the strike. That is the sticking point, and the government finally had to agree. There was a delay of 24 hours. The government had to agree that Coron and a whole number of other dissidents who'd in fact been arrested for their activity in support of the working class should be released from prison. And so there's this mighty achievement, fantastic victory of the Polish workers. I think I just want to say something about the Interfactory Strike Committee, because I didn't actually recognise it at the time, and I think I'm not sure that any of us recognised at the time the full significance of what the Interfactory Strike Committee was. If you think about it, what was it? An organisation made up of delegates from enterprises, regardless of what sort of enterprise they were. The Jastrzębie enterprise had workers from a beauty salon who went on strike, and they sent a delegate to it, along with miners. Railwaymen, engineers, shipyard workers, hospital workers, it didn't matter what industry you were in. Nobody asked, what trade are you in? What industry are you in? Are you skilled or unskilled or anything like that? It was, if you were a delegate from a striking enterprise, you were on the Interfactory Strike Committee. So it was an organisation, a strike organisation of workers, irrespective of trade and industry. It was also a strike organisation of workers that raised political demands, and it was a strike organisation of workers that began in small ways to establish elements of workers' control over production and distribution. There is another word for that sort of organisation. It's called a Soviet. Now, the workers of Poland didn't realise it, didn't recognise it, but out of their own experience, they had recreated the Soviet. What they think Soviets are is Russian tanks that threaten to shoot them. But actually, they recreated the form that the workers in 1905 in Russia and again in 1917, they recreated the form of the Workers' Council. Now, that huge victory in Poland just continued to grow. Because after the August victory, the new organisation of workers just grew and grew and grew at the most incredible pace. 3 weeks after the victory, at the end of August, about the 20th of September, there was the first meeting, national meeting of delegates from inter-factory strike committees, held in Gdansk in the shipyard. And delegates came from all over Poland to discuss what they should now do. And they decided they would now form a single union called Solidarity. This independent, self-governing union, Solidarity. And when they counted up how many members they got, they knew about at that time, they already had 3 million members. That was after 3 weeks. They could count 3 million people who'd signed up. I mean, in one city, the city of Poznan, the union had got hold of an extremely small office in a city square. You know, we had to go upstairs to this extremely small office, sort of much worse than the sort of premises we have, but a little tiny office. And 200,000 workers in Poznan over the previous 3 weeks had queued night and day to go up the stairs, get their car and come down again. And that was happening all over Poland, that millions of workers were joining. By 4 months after the foundation of Solidarity, 10 million workers had joined Solidarity. Something like 10 million. Given that the total size of the labour force, manual and white collar, in Poland is 12 million, you see the size of their achievement. Within 3 or 4 months, they had organised 80% of the Polish working class into a single union. One movement, one with a marvelous slogan, well, the marvelous name simply, Solidarity. 80%, highest level, as far as I know, of any working class organisation, just in terms of a trade union organisation, anywhere in the world. This, of course, the creation of this new organisation, of course, threw the ruling class into immense crisis. I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which one can illustrate. Just a little story, perhaps, to illustrate this. There was a doctor who wrote an article, actually, in a Communist Party newspaper, describing what happened in her hospital. She was in charge of people with nervous disorders in a ward. And she described what happened in her hospital during August and September of 1980. She said, suddenly, the working class patients started to get better. They got better much faster than they were supposed to, according to medical advice. They started discharging themselves from hospital with smiles on their faces. And the hospital was just empty. And then there was a short period of empty hospital. And then the hospital started to fill up again with managers who were feeling extremely upset and suffering from nervous disorders, and so on and so on. And party secretaries, lower functionaries of the party, and so on and so on and so on. And she remarks, I faced a serious ethical problem as a doctor. Should I try to cure them? Now, what had emerged in Poland as a result of the growth of Solidarity was a situation which practically we can recognise as a situation of dual power. On the one hand, this vibrant, democratic, working class organisation, with workers for the first time having a fantastic feeling of confidence, and so on and so on. On the other hand, the armed state crumbling in many ways. Solidarity taking the form of Soviets, a federation of Soviets, a federation of inter-factory strike committees. A form that was absolutely hated by the regime. There's a Communist Party speaker, Communist Party boss, addressing the his hacks and security officials in the south, in Katowice. And there was a Solidarity spy in the meeting, who tape recorded the meeting, and then the whole thing was published. And he said, we must break the idea of regional organisation as the basis of this union. What we must go back to is the idea of organisation on the basis of trade and industry. What we've got to do is try and persuade the railway worker that he shouldn't be in the same union as a fashion designer. Break down the very strength of this new form of workers' organisation, which the working class in Poland have developed, rediscovering, as I say, the Soviet form. The tragedy, as we'll see, is that although there were Soviets in Poland, there was no party, there was no Lenin. But we'll come to that in time. For 7 months, really, from after August, there was a process of a rising movement in Poland. In the city of Szczecin, the local newspaper published an attack on Solidarity. The response to Solidarity was to occupy the local printing works, which belonged to the party, and to print 400,000 leaflets. They then took over the trams next day in the whole of Szczecin and plastered them with posters and went up and down the city, students and workers with loud halos, reading out the leaflet to people in the streets, putting a copy of the leaflet into every newspaper on sale in the kiosks in Szczecin. Huge demonstration. They just took over the trams and issued counter-propaganda. After that, the attacks on Solidarity in the local paper declined somewhat. A fantastic demonstration, simply of a reply to ruling class propaganda. In November, everybody remembers the case of Sarah, or lots of comrades anyway, will remember the name of Sarah Tisdall, the British civil servant who was arrested and jailed for leaking information about cruise missiles to CND, or through The Guardian. The Poles had their own Sarah Tisdall. His name was Peter Sapiello. He was a junior civil servant, and he leaked to Solidarity a document which had been produced in the Prosecutor General's office about how to deal with dissidents. And he and a guy called Jan Narozniak started printing it in the Solidarity offices in Warsaw for distribution to Solidarity. And the secret police raided the place and he was arrested. He was rather luckier than Sarah Tisdall, because he did this in the middle of a rising workers' movement. The whole of Warsaw went on strike. And they demanded the release of Narozniak and Sapiello, and they demanded a cut in the security police budget. And that all workers should get the same pensions as the security police. A whole series of demands started to develop further, which hadn't been raised before, precisely in the context of the struggle, beginning to question the power of the organised bodies of the state, particularly the hated ZOMO, the security police. They were released after 2 days, and never charged. No cases ever brought against Narozniak and Sapiello for doing what Sarah Tisdall had done. And the demands continued to grow. As I say, in different strikes up and down Poland, demands were raised, as I said, about cutting police budgets, all sorts of public buildings which had been allocated for the use of the police and various branches of the state were simply, there were strikes to demand that these should be turned over for the use of workers, for the National Health Service, for nurseries, for clinics, and so on and so on. Hundreds of public buildings had their uses converted by the workers in the period from September through to March 1981. Dozens, or actually hundreds and hundreds of officials were tumbled from office. I mean, the sort of thing that would happen would be, one example, in an aircraft factory at Mielec, the party secretary in early September 1980 circulated a petition for workers to sign saying, "We, the workers of the Mielec aircraft factory, do not need Solidarity. Sign here," he said. And so they decided, well, they would respond to this. So they got another petition which said, "We, the workers of the aircraft factory Mielec, demand the immediate removal of the first party secretary for Mielec." And he was removed. Workers in Czestochowa had the governor of the province removed. Hundreds and hundreds of officials of all sorts of levels were simply kicked out of office because of the workers' protests over their corruption, over their brutality, and so on and so on. They took over the control, in part, of the rationing system. Workers simply went to inspect. They sent inspection teams to inspect the warehouses to make sure that the workers weren't being cheated over the supplies of food and so on, as indeed they were being cheated, and they stopped the cheating, and so on. And one other thing that has to be said is this workers' movement grew, that it had enormous knock-on effects outside the working class. Other sections of society were drawn into the struggle behind the workers' movement. So that Solidarity became more than simply a workers' movement, it became a movement of all the oppressed and all the exploited in Poland. So that, for example, 3 million peasants formed a new organisation called Rural Solidarity. Workers went on strike up and down Poland in support of the peasants' right to form their own independent organisation and to negotiate with the government over the prices available that peasants would be paid for food, over the supplies of all the sorts of things that peasants needed for running their farms, and so on and so on. The student movement burgeoned in the aftermath of Solidarity. There were student occupations in every university and college up and down Poland, and the student unions, the existing student unions, were destroyed and replaced by independent self-governing student unions. The philatelists formed their own independent self-governing organisation of philatelists. Allotment holders would go to Solidarity with their complaints, and the advice would be form an independent self-governing union of allotment holders, and so on and so on. The idea of self-organisation, of self-emancipation, took hold in the most amazing sense in Polish society. Even the prisoners in the jail, every jail in Poland had some kind of demonstration or riot, and with Solidarity members often demonstrating outside the prisons, banners and shouting over the walls and through the windows and so on. One of the prisoners' demands was, "We demand as much meat as police dogs." Now, all of this, of course, through the Communist Party, which was a big organisation, several million, about 3 million, into immense demoralisation and confusion. 1 million of the Communist Party's working class members joined Solidarity, but remained inside the Communist Party. And when the test of their loyalty was made in January 1981, when Solidarity called for strikes and told the Communist Party members they were not to strike, the Communist Party members struck. They took the side of Solidarity rather than the side of their party bosses. And so this movement, as I say, rose and rose and rose, challenge after challenge to the government, with the government retreating and retreating and retreating, and being beaten time and again, until the end of March, until March 1981. And then you get a turning point. Because in March 1981, there's a crisis. Every movement that rises eventually comes up against a crisis. The crisis occurred in a town called Bydgoszcz. And in Bydgoszcz, Solidarity leaders in the city were beaten up by security police. A man called Jan Rulewski and others were beaten up by the security police. This was the first time, actually, that the regime had used physical violence against the workers' movement. Up to now, you have to remember, not a worker had died, there had not been a major physical confrontation between the regime and the workers. This is the first one of any significance. There had been old people arrested and rapidly sprung from prison and so on, but this was the first time that beatings had been used. They were hospitalised. Solidarity produced thousands of posters showing their injured faces and plastered them all over Poland and called for a 4-hour general strike in Poland. And the 4-hour general strike was completely solid. The whole of Poland just stopped for the period of the 4-hour general strike. Nothing moved. It was complete demonstration of complete working class solidarity, complete working class unity. The whole of the membership of the Communist Party that was in Solidarity was absolutely 100% behind Solidarity, very often helping to organise the strikes, and so on and so on. And Solidarity leadership said, if we haven't won after the 4-hour general strike, then on the 31st of March we will start an unlimited general strike. And then the church moved in. I mean, the church moved in before it, ineffectively. The Pope announced that voices were reaching him from Poland, saying that workers did not want to go on strike. Whatever the voices were telling him, it sounds like it's the angels speaking to him in a dream, but whatever he might say, actually the workers in Poland were organising for the occupation of their factories. They were taking sleeping bags and food supplies in, barricade materials into their factories and so on. The government said, if you go ahead with the general strike, the Russian army will come in. The church put enormous pressure on Wałęsa, isolated him from the rest of the leadership, and Wałęsa independently went on television with a man called Gwiazda and announced, without any reference to anybody else in Solidarity, that the general strike was cancelled. That situation provoked an enormous row inside the Solidarity leadership. Wałęsa was accused of acting completely undemocratically, and so on and so on. But interestingly, there wasn't a single wildcat strike that followed the announcement of the calling off the general strike. There was no basis of independent organisation, independent of the leadership of Solidarity. Nothing existed of that sort, and nobody was arguing for it. And the whole argument of those who were disgusted by what Wałęsa had done was that he'd actually done democratically. They didn't actually put forward any alternatives. And so, having risen and risen and risen up to the end of March, suddenly Solidarity went into an immense crisis. There were two effects from this. The first one was that there was tremendous demobilisation of workers. For the next 3 months in Poland, after Poland had a strike every day, major strikes every day, suddenly for 3 months there's not a strike in Poland. April, May, June, not a strike to be seen anywhere in Poland. Demoralisation, confusion amongst the membership. That's one side of it. For 3 months, I say, just no strikes at all. The second effect of it is that the leadership, many of them, of Solidarity, the cadres, as it were, of Solidarity, started turning towards politics. They started in particular talking about advancing the demand for self-management in the factory. Unfortunately, they did this in a way, they did it in a context where they were out of touch with their members who were not active in this period. And they did it in a way where they spent far too much time discussing with academic experts, the sorts of people perhaps you might find in the GLC, for the Polish equivalent, or the left Catholics and so on. They discussed schemes for legislation for self-management and so on. Their method of approach to the question of self-management was to try and develop a rational case for self-management by workers in industry that they would then offer to the ruling class and try and convince the ruling class that this was the right way to proceed. They consistently did not aim for power. They talked about, this is the period when the most theorization goes on inside Solidarity, after the Big Gosh defeat. They talked about the need to have what they called a self-limiting revolution. That's to say, a revolution which would capture, civil, as they put it, civil society, the world of the economy, private life, but would not in fact take over the state, would not destroy the existing state. Now, that's the situation. For 3 months, there's these kinds of discussions going on amongst the intellectuals and the leaders of Solidarity, and the working class remarkably passive. However, Poland was in a mounting economic crisis, and the pressures of that crisis, in terms of just everyday experience, were pressing on workers. The food supplies were getting worse and worse. If you had a headache, you couldn't buy aspirin. If you were menstruating, you couldn't get a tampon in Poland because of the shortages of supplies. The factories were running on half and quarter time because of shortages of raw materials, shortages of needed supplies to put your components and so on to complete production. And in July, there's a revival, fantastic revival of conflict because of the economic issues. There were hunger marches in numbers of cities up and down Poland. In Łódź, there was a huge hunger march of tens of thousands of people with slogans like, "The hungry will eat their rulers," or "We are marching towards communism, comrade, please do not expect to eat on the way." And satirical slogans of this time, "Hungry of the world, unite," was another slogan. Enormous demands that there should be an improvement in the food supply. And that was the hunger strikes in various cities were then followed by a whole wave of wildcat strikes. Not called by the Solidarity leadership, but called by the local leaders in up and down Poland, in different parts of the country. And those wildcat strikes demanded improvements in the food supplies and so on, but they increasingly were raising radical demands about the removal of the party from the factory, and so on, and so on, and so on. But it has to be said that it was a completely, on the one hand, it was a spontaneous movement amongst workers up and down Poland, the wildcat strike movement that lasted through the summer and the early autumn. It's also the case that Solidarity, there was no lead given to those strikes, nobody saw the need, nobody acted to try and connect those strikes together. The Solidarity leadership tried to cool them off. Lech Wałęsa became absolutely nervously exhausted in that period because he rushed around Poland acting as a fireman, putting out fires, damping down workers' demands, urging them to go back to work, and so on and so on and so on. And that's the period in which, in the autumn of 1981, against this background, the regime decided it was time to open up a new offensive against Solidarity. The government was increasingly becoming militarized. Several generals were taken into the cabinet. Army groups were formed, and in October, the government announced it was going to send out small groups of soldiers, a corporal and, very, very small groups, 3 soldiers, those sorts of groups. They would send them out into the villages, they said, to help the people with the harvest, and to help with overcoming blockages in the distribution system. In reality, of course, they were sent out to suss out what the strategic situation was in different parts of the country. They also performed this helping role and won themselves some sort of social base here and there. When they were recalled from the countryside, they were then sent into the factories, and they went into the, you'd have a situation where an officer and a couple of soldiers would turn up at a factory and say, "Oh, we're coming to see what sort of situation the factory is in if there were an American invasion." And the workers actually believed them. There was no warning issued by Solidarity about what the regime might be preparing, about the dangers of the army acting against them, and so on. If anything, Solidarity went along with the illusion which many Polish workers had that, oh, the Polish army is our army, it's not the Russian army, it's our army, they will never act against Polish workers, and so on and so on. And they prepared the way for the coup. In October they announced that for the next 2 months, there was a whole number of conscript soldiers who were due to be demobbed because they'd done their 2 years national service. And it was simply announced that they were not going to be demobbed, they'd have to stay for another 2 months in the army. Because the last thing that the regime wanted was to have a new wave of recruits coming into the army as they were preparing a coup, new wave of young working class recruits who'd just been through the experience of more than a year of Solidarity activism and membership and so on. The numbers of soldiers, in fact, who were due for demob, sent letters to Solidarity, begging Solidarity to support them in their demand to be immediately released from the army so that they could join their brothers and sisters in the factories and the offices in the fight against the regime. Solidarity published the letters, but did nothing. Didn't organise demonstrations outside the army camps or anything like that. It just seemed to be paralysed. And so you have a situation in which the strike wave was increasingly battered by simply defeat after defeat, isolation, fragmentation of the movement and so on. The membership became increasingly demoralized, increasingly demobilized. There was a decline finally in the last month of solidarity. It's interesting to see there was actually a decline in the level of strike. So by the time, early December, the coup happened on the 13th of December. By the end of November, early December, there was hardly a strike in Poland. Hardly a strike. The first strike movement was over. The second wildcat strike movement was over. Workers were passive and uncertain what to do. There was more and more ill temper amongst workers. There had been a whole period in the rise of solidarity when if you joined a food queue, you joined a collective organisation and you had political discussions and people would help each other, take each other's places in the queue. There were things called queue committees formed. You had self-governing independent queue committees formed on the spot outside a meat shop or something like that. Now people were fighting in the queues and grumbling against each other in the queues. They were grumbling against the leaders of solidarity and so on and so on. Right at the end, in the last week or two, there were signs that the leadership of Solidarity, or some of them, had seen the danger and were beginning to talk in more militant and revolutionary terms. There were representatives from Wojciech and elsewhere who came to the National Committee, special meeting in Radom, and talked about the need to form workers' guards, to organise a general strike, to change to advance the movement once more. One of the, a man called Motilevsky, who was the co-author with Kuron of the Open Letters to the Party in the 1960s, said we have to face the fact that our movement is in a very bad state, that we have very little respect, we have very little base now in terms of activity amongst workers and so on. Then the coup came. I mean, it came out of the blue, nobody expected it. It was complete, nobody was ready for it. And the coup came on the night of the 13th of December, Sunday, the early hours of the morning of the 13th of December. And quite simply, it smashed the organisation of Solidarity. Smashed it. All the leadership that could be found, nearly all of them were arrested in their beds and so on, taken off to internment camps. And it has to be said, I think, that there were, of course, demonstrations against the coup, there were strikes against the coup. The fact, I think, one has to say is that the working class movement had already been defeated before the coup, because there was very little response. In terms of what there'd been before, there was remarkably little response by the workers. Of course, they were taken by surprise and so on, but the fact is there was very little response. In one of the pits in Silesia, the miners stayed underground in protest for 2 weeks and were finally persuaded to come up. And when they came up to defeat, they could not believe that the whole of Poland was not on strike with them. They were horrified to discover how isolated they'd actually been. There's only a few pits that had actually done anything, and the most of the Polish working class actually had just been inactive, faithfully coup. But to just illustrate this, I mean, the government then set about, of course, dismantling all the things. But first, just to perhaps illustrate the significance of the whole thing, the first organisation that was banned by the regime after the coup was not Solidarity, it wasn't the peasants' organisation, it wasn't the students' organisation, it was queue committees. There was a government announcement that in future, shop assistants were not to deal with representatives of queue committees, which were illegal organisations of a subversive character. You know, an organisation, a self-organisation of people in a queue to make life a little bit easier, helping by keeping each other's places and so on, was no longer to be allowed. Fairness in queuing was no longer to be permitted. Self-organised fairness in queuing was no longer to be permitted by the regime. In a sense, it symbolises what it was that the regime was out to crush. The first thing that they banned was, in fact, an elementary form of self-organisation by working people. Now, I'm running over my time. I'll end very quickly. The tragedy, quite clearly, of Poland is the tragedy of a fantastic workers' movement that demanded self-management, whose final demands emerged as a demand which we could translate our own demands into. It's not bad. It's the demand for a self-managing republic. That was the final demand of the workers' movement as it was developed at the Solidarity Congress in the autumn of 1981. Their programme, a self-managing republic. They demanded self-management and self-organisation by the working class as the principle of life. Fantastic movement. Amazing movement. The most impressive workers' movement that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime, I think. On the other hand, they never challenged state power. They were held back by their own theory of the self-limiting revolution. You have to ask why. Why did this happen? One reason, quite certainly, is of course what had happened to previous movements in Eastern Europe. In 1956, the Hungarian Revolution was crushed by Russian attack. In 1968, the movement for socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia was crushed by Russian attack. There was a fantastic inhibition, a fear, we mustn't go too far or the Russians will come in and smash us. That was the argument, essentially. We mustn't go too far because of what they call geopolitical reasons. In other words, the Russians. But I think we have to be quite clear. That was a risk. We have to be absolutely clear, though, if you look at the history of solidarity, that if there's a risk of being destroyed by military means if you go too far, there is an absolute certainty of being destroyed if you don't go far enough. Because actually what they did was in a sense to hold back their own movement and in a sense to defeat themselves. That self-limitation was a road that inevitably led to disaster for them, whereas the other road, the road of revolution, is a road of risks, but it isn't the road of certain defeats. I think we have to say that there were really two reasons for the defeat of solidarity, for the prevalence of those sorts of ideas in solidarity. And they're important for us, and this is why I want to end it. The first one was the isolation of the Polish workers. The fact is that although there was enormous sympathy for the Polish workers up and down the world, although there was fantastic sympathy, although Solidarity's logo became an international symbol of workers' revolt, of the demand for freedom and so on. It was taken up by South African workers, it was taken up by Zambian copper belt workers who wore Solidarność t-shirts on their picket lines in 1981. It was taken up by American air traffic controllers on strike against Reagan who wore the Solidarność logo on their t-shirts on their picket lines. Nonetheless, in practical terms, the movement remained isolated. You can't point to any significant workers' movement in support of solidarity in the most important places, in particular, of course, in other countries around them in Eastern Europe. That's the first thing. And therefore, they felt isolated in the world. The second thing that I think is very important is the influence of reform in the world. You see, when this little tiny group called CORE, that really can be credited with having launched solidarity, when they looked around them in the world for ideas, what did they see? They saw the Italian Communist Party with its idea of historic compromise, mass party. They saw the French Socialist Party and the French Communist Party with reformist ideas. They saw the British Labour Party. Everywhere they looked around them in Europe, what did they see? Mass reformist parties. Did they see the Socialist Workers' Party with its excellent arguments for revolutionary organisation? No, because we had 3,000 members. We didn't compete. We didn't compete. The tragedy, in a sense, is that when they looked around in the world, they saw the predominant ideas in the workers' movement, and they followed those ideas. They didn't see the challenge from the revolutionary left because the revolutionary left was too small in the world. And if anybody in this room, and I imagine everybody in this room does fall into this category, regards solidarity as a fantastic workers' movement and wished it to come to victory and laments the tragedy of its defeat, they have to ask themselves, what part do I play in the defeat? In particular, what part do I play in making sure it doesn't happen again? Because there's one thing that is certain. The Polish workers will rise again. If there's one working class in the world of whom you can be certain they will rise again, it is the Poles. They rose in 56 and smashed the government. They rose in 70 and smashed the government. They rose in 76 and smashed the price rises. They rose in 1980 and created the biggest trade union movement, the best trade union movement, the best workers' movement that we've seen in the world since the war anyway. They will rise again. The question is, will they be defeated again? What ideas will they have? What will they see in the world when they look around next time? And that's a question for us. You see, the question of our size, the question of our politics is absolutely crucial, not only in our own country, but everywhere in the world. If you really want to make sure that the Polish working class wins next time, you actually have to build the Socialist Workers' Party here. There is an inextricable link between the two questions. So draw the moral from solidarity and join the SWP.